The scar running down Emma Catherine Walsh's left forearm told a story that most people in Millbrook Valley would never believe. It wasn't from a kitchen accident or a childhood fall. It was from the teeth of a half-starved mongrel who had contested. Her claim to a discarded potato peel behind Henderson's General Store on a bitter February morning in 1887. At 17, Emma had learned that survival meant fighting for every scrap, every opportunity, every moment of warmth in a world that had forgotten she existed. The people of Millbrook saw her as nothing more than a shadow flitting between alleyways, a reminder of what happened when families fell apart and society's safety nets failed. But they didn't see the fierce intelligence burning behind her hollow green eyes, or the unbreakable spirit that had kept her alive through 3 brutal winters on the streets. They certainly never imagined that this ragged, skeletal girl would one day transform not just her own destiny, but the very fabric of their mountain community. Today, as snow began to fall on the Colorado Rockies and the temperature dropped toward another killing frost, Emma Walsh was about to encounter a man whose simple promise would change everything she thought she knew about hunger, hope, and what it meant to finally belong somewhere. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind cut through Emma's threadbare coat like a blade as she pressed herself against the brick wall behind Morrison's bakery, waiting for the moment when old Frank Morrison would emerge with the day's refuse. Her stomach had been empty for 2 days now, not uncommon, but reaching the point where the gnawing pain had transformed into a dull, persistent ache that made her hands shake and her vision blur at the edges. At 17, Emma Catherine Walsh had been living on the streets of Millbrook Valley for 4 years, ever since consumption had claimed both her parents within 6 months of each other, leaving her orphaned with nothing but a mountain of medical debts that had consumed their modest homestead. The county poorhouse had been full, the distant relatives either unable or unwilling to take in another mouth to feed, and Emma had discovered that survival was a skill learned quickly or not at all. She had grown expert at reading the rhythms of the town's waste disposal, knowing which establishments threw out edible scraps and when, which shopkeepers might be sympathetic to a polite request for work, and which areas to avoid when the local toughs were looking for entertainment at the expense of someone who couldn't fight back. But knowledge and cunning could only carry her so far when winter was approaching, and her body was consuming itself to stay alive. The back door of the bakery creaked open, and Frank Morrison emerged carrying a wooden crate filled with bread that had gone stale, pastries that had been damaged in handling, and the occasional luxury of fruit that had passed its prime. Emma watched from her hiding spot as he dumped the contents into the large refuse bin behind his store, muttering under his breath about waste and overhead costs. She waited 15 minutes after his return to the shop before making her move, approaching the bin with the practiced stealth of someone who had learned that hesitation often meant the difference between eating and going hungry. But as she lifted the wooden lid, the sound of low growling froze her blood. 3 dogs, mongrels by their mixed breeding, but large and desperate by their lean appearance, had already claimed the treasure trove of discarded food. The largest, a brindle-colored animal with scars across its muzzle, looked up from a half-eaten apple turnover with eyes that held the same hollow desperation Emma recognized in her own reflection. For a moment, girl and dogs regarded each other in tense silence, each calculating the other's strength and determination. Emma's rational mind told her to back away, to search for easier pickings elsewhere, to avoid a confrontation that could leave her injured and even worse off than before. But her empty stomach and the sight of fresh bread lying just beyond the reach of snapping jaws overruled caution. "Easy," she whispered, extending one trembling hand toward the nearest piece of bread while keeping her eyes fixed on the pack leader. "There's enough for all of us." The brindle dog's response was immediate and violent. It lunged forward with a snarl that spoke of too many lean days and too much competition for too little food. Emma jerked her hand back, but not quickly enough. To avoid the rake of teeth across her forearm that opened a gash from wrist to elbow, pain flared bright and immediate. But Emma's survival instincts kicked in before shock could take hold. She grabbed a broken fence slat from beside the bin and swung it in a wide arc that caught the attacking dog across the ribs, sending it stumbling backward with a yelp of surprise. The other two dogs circled warily, unsure whether to press the attack or retreat in the face of unexpected resistance. "I'm not leaving empty-handed," Emma declared through gritted teeth, her voice carrying authority that seemed to surprise the animals as much as it surprised her. Blood was running down her arm and dripping from her fingertips, but she maintained her grip on the makeshift weapon while using her other hand to snatch a loaf of day-old bread from the bin. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with the dogs testing her resolve through feints and threatening postures while Emma stood her ground despite the pain radiating from her injured arm. Finally, perhaps recognizing that this particular human was as desperate and determined as they were, the pack leader backed down with a final warning growl before trotting away. Toward easier prospects, Emma waited until all three animals had disappeared around the corner of the building before allowing herself to examine her wound. The gash was deep but clean, and while it would need attention to prevent infection, it wasn't immediately life-threatening. More importantly, she had successfully defended her claim to the food that might keep her alive for another few days. She wrapped the bread in the cleanest portion of her skirt and began the careful process of cleaning her wound with water from the public pump in the town square. The cold mountain water stung like fire against the torn flesh, but Emma had learned to work through pain as automatically as breathing. Physical discomfort was temporary. Starvation was forever if you let it win. As she worked, she became aware of eyes watching her from across the square. This wasn't unusual. The townspeople often stared at her with mixtures of pity, disgust, and uncomfortable recognition of how thin the line was between their security and her desperation. But this gaze felt different, more focused and thoughtful than the casual observation of passers-by. She looked up to see a man standing beside the loading dock of Peterson's hardware store, his attention fixed entirely on her impromptu medical treatment. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of solid build that spoke of years of physical labor in challenging conditions. His clothes were practical rather than fashionable: heavy canvas pants, a wool coat that had seen considerable wear, and boots that were built for function rather than appearance. But it was his face that caught Emma's attention and held it. Weathered by sun and wind, framed by dark hair that needed cutting, it was the face of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. More importantly, his expression as he watched her showed neither the pity nor disgust she was accustomed to seeing, but something that looked almost like recognition, as if he understood exactly what he was witnessing and why it mattered. When their eyes met across the square, Emma felt an unexpected jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with fear or embarrassment. The stranger's gaze was direct but not intrusive, curious without being predatory, and somehow managed to convey both respect and concern without making her feel like an object of charity. After a moment that seemed to stretch much longer than it actually lasted, the man touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more acknowledgement than greeting, then turned and disappeared into the hardware store. Emma stared after him for several seconds, unsettled by the brief encounter in ways she couldn't quite name. The sound of approaching voices reminded her that lingering in the town square was an invitation for trouble. She finished her rough bandaging job using strips torn from her petticoat, gathered her precious bread, and headed for the abandoned cabin on the outskirts of town where she had been sheltering for the past month. The cabin had once belonged to a prospector named Jenkins who had given up his claims after a cave-in had crushed his legs and left him unable to work. It was barely more than a shack, 4 walls, a leaking roof, and a stone fireplace that drew poorly, but it provided protection from the elements and a place where Emma could rest without worrying about being moved along by authorities or threatened by those who saw her vulnerability as opportunity. She had done what she could to make the space habitable, using scavenged materials to patch the worst holes in the walls and gathering enough firewood to last through the early part of winter. But as October gave way to November and the nights grew steadily colder, Emma knew that her current shelter would not be adequate for the brutal cold that was coming. The Colorado mountains showed no mercy to those caught unprepared when the snow began to fall in earnest. Every winter, people died from exposure, starvation, or the diseases that flourished when human beings were pushed beyond their limits of endurance. Emma had survived 3 such winters through a combination of luck, determination, and an absolute refusal to give up no matter how desperate her circumstances became. But this year felt different. The summer had been particularly harsh, with drought conditions that had made even temporary work almost impossible to find. The town's established families were holding onto their resources more tightly than usual, and charity, never abundant in a frontier community, had become almost non-existent. Emma's body was showing the cumulative effects of years of malnutrition and exposure. She tired more easily than she once had, recovered more slowly from illness or injury, and found it increasingly difficult to maintain the physical strength necessary for the kind of scavenging and odd jobs that had kept her alive. At 17, she sometimes felt like an old woman trapped in a young woman's body, aged beyond her years by circumstances that would have broken most people long before dot as she settled into her makeshift bed that evening, a pile of straw covered. With every piece of fabric she had been able to collect, Emma allowed herself a few minutes to remember what her life had been like before her parents' deaths. The Walsh family had never been wealthy, but they had owned their small farm outright and lived with the security that came from having enough food, adequate shelter, and the knowledge that they belonged somewhere. Her father, Patrick Walsh, had been a quiet man who found joy in coaxing vegetables from rocky soil and teaching his daughter to read using his small collection of books. Her mother, Catherine, had possessed a gentle strength that made their modest home feel like a sanctuary from the harsh realities of frontier life. Together, they had created the kind of stable, loving environment that Emma now understood was precious beyond measure. The consumption had taken them both with cruel efficiency, reducing strong, capable adults to hollow shadows of themselves before claiming their lives entirely. Emma had watched helplessly as her world contracted from security to uncertainty to outright desperation, learning with each loss that the universe owed her nothing, and that survival was a daily choice rather than a guaranteed outcome. But tonight, as she lay listening to the wind rattling the loose boards of her shelter, Emma found her thoughts returning to the stranger she had encountered in the town square. Something about his presence had felt different from the casual observations of other townspeople, more intentional, more significant. Though she couldn't articulate exactly why, she had become an expert at reading people's reactions to her circumstances, categorizing them quickly as potential threats, sources of aid, or simply obstacles to avoid. But this man had defied easy classification, watching her with an intensity that suggested genuine interest rather than morbid curiosity or automatic sympathy. As sleep finally claimed her despite the cold that seeped through every gap in her inadequate shelter, Emma Walsh had no way of knowing that her brief encounter with the stranger would prove to be the beginning of a transformation that would reshape not only her own life but the destiny of everyone in Millbrook Valley. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for both triumph and disaster, and the chance to discover that sometimes salvation arrived in the most unexpected forms. The mountain wind continued to howl around her fragile shelter, carrying with it the promise of snow and the reminder that winter was coming whether she was ready or not. But for the first time in months, Emma fell asleep with something other than despair occupying her thoughts, a curiosity about the man with weathered hands and understanding eyes who had watched her fight for survival and somehow made her feel seen rather than simply observed. Outside, The first snowflakes of the season began to fall, each one a harbinger of the trials and revelations that lay ahead. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dawn broke gray and bitter over Millbrook Valley, bringing with it the kind of biting wind that promised snow before nightfall. Emma woke to the sound of her own teeth chattering, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air of her makeshift shelter. The wound on her arm throbbed with a dull ache that spoke of inflammation, and when she examined the makeshift bandage in the pale morning light, she could see the telltale signs of infection beginning to set in. She had maybe 3 days before the wound became serious enough to threaten her life, and that was only if she could keep it clean and find some way to treat it properly. In her current circumstances, both requirements seemed nearly impossible to fulfill. The bread from yesterday's confrontation with the dogs had provided enough sustenance to clear her head and restore some of her strength, but it was already gone, leaving her to face another day of scavenging with winter closing in around the valley like a trap. Emma wrapped her thinnest shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside to assess the weather conditions that would determine her strategy for the day. The sight that greeted her stopped her cold. Sitting on a tree stump 20 yards from her cabin, as if he had been waiting there all night, was the stranger from the town square. In the harsh morning light, she could see him more clearly, a man perhaps in his early 30s, with the kind of weathered appearance that spoke of years spent in the mountains rather than in civilized society. He was whittling something from a piece of pine wood, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy as he shaped whatever he was creating. A leather satchel sat beside him on the ground, along with what appeared to be a bundle wrapped in oiled canvas. Most importantly, there was no threat in his posture, no tension that suggested he meant her harm. When he noticed her emergence from the cabin, he looked up with the same direct gaze she remembered from their brief encounter in town. "Morning," he said simply, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them, despite its quiet tone. Emma's survival instincts screamed warnings about strange men who appeared without invitation at isolated locations, but something about his manner suggested patience rather than predation. Still, she kept her distance and positioned herself where she could retreat quickly if necessary. "You're on private property," she said, though they both knew the abandoned cabin belonged to no one in particular and that her claim to it was tenuous at best. "Reckon I am," he agreed, continuing his whittling without apparent concern. "Thought you might want to know that Jenkins fellow who used to live here, he died last week down in Colorado Springs. Natural causes, according to the letter his nephew sent to the land office." The information hit Emma like a physical blow. She had been telling herself that Jenkins might return someday, and that her occupation of his cabin was temporary. But the news of his death meant that the property would likely be sold or reclaimed, leaving her without even this inadequate shelter. As winter approached, "Nephew's planning to sell the land come spring," the stranger continued, as if reading her thoughts. "Means you've got maybe 4 months before someone comes looking to clear out squatters." Emma's mind raced through her limited options. 4 months might be enough to survive the winter if she could find adequate food and fuel, but it wouldn't provide any long-term security. And that assumed she could even make it through the next few weeks without succumbing to cold, hunger, or the infection that was already taking hold in her wounded arm. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, suspicious of information offered without apparent price or expectation. The man looked up from his carving, studying her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Because you've got spirit," he said finally. "Watched you yesterday, fighting those dogs for food. Most folks would have backed down, accepted hunger rather than risk injury. But you stood your ground and claimed what you needed to survive." "Desperation makes people do foolish things," Emma replied, though she felt a small flush of pride at his assessment of her actions. Desperation makes weak people do foolish things, he corrected. Make strong people do what's necessary, regardless of the cost. Question is, what are you planning to do when that arm gets worse and winter really sets in? Emma glanced down at her bandaged forearm, surprised that he had noticed the injury from such a distance. I'll manage, she said with more confidence. Then she felt. The stranger nodded thoughtfully, then stood and approached slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. As he drew nearer, Emma could see that he was even larger than she had initially estimated, not just tall, but broad through the shoulders and chest in a way that suggested enormous physical strength. Yet his approach was careful, respectful, of her obvious wariness. Name's Marcus Thompson, he said when he was close enough for normal conversation. I've got a cabin about 15 miles up the mountain, near the old silver mine workings. Been living there for 8 years now, mostly. Keeping to myself. Emma said nothing, waiting to see where this introduction was leading. Thing is, Marcus continued, winter's coming hard this year. Old-timers are saying it'll be the worst in a decade, and from what I've seen of the signs, they're probably right. Temperature's going to drop below anything this valley's seen in recent memory, and the snow's going to pile up deep enough to bury anything that's not built to handle it. He gestured toward her cabin with its sagging roof and gap-filled walls. This place won't keep you alive through what's coming. Hell, it might not keep you alive through next week if that storm moves in, like I think it will. Emma's throat tightened with fear she refused to show. What's it to you whether I live or die? You don't even know me. Marcus paused in his slow approach, considering her question with obvious seriousness. Fair point, he acknowledged. Truth is, I don't make a habit of involving myself in other people's troubles. Came to these mountains specifically to get away from complications and obligations. He resumed walking until he was close enough that Emma could see the details of his weathered face, the lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and snow, the small scar along his jaw that suggested past violence, the calloused hands that had clearly seen years of hard labor. But I've been watching this town for 8 years now, he continued, and in all that time, I've never seen anyone show the kind of backbone you displayed yesterday. Most folks, when they're pushed to the edge, they either give up or they turn. Mean, you just got stronger. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, unsure how to respond to praise from a stranger who seemed to see qualities in her that she wasn't certain she actually possessed. I've got a proposition for you, Marcus said, reaching into his leather satchel and withdrawing something wrapped in clean cloth. My cabin's built to handle mountain winters. Stone foundation, thick walls, good chimney, enough firewood stockpiled to last until spring. I've got preserved food, medical supplies, tools, everything needed to wait out the cold months in comfort. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal fresh bread, dried meat, and what appeared to be some kind of preserved fruit. The sight and smell of real food made Emma's empty stomach clench with desperate hunger, but she forced herself to maintain her wary stance. What's the catch? She asked, though her eyes remained fixed on the food. No catch, Marcus replied, rewrapping the provisions and setting them on the ground between them. I'm offering you shelter, food, warmth, and safety through the winter. In exchange, you help with cooking, mending, general maintenance around the cabin. Simple partnership your labor in exchange for survival. Emma's mind immediately jumped to the obvious concerns. And what makes you think I'd trust a strange man enough to isolate myself with him in a mountain cabin for months? Marcus nodded, as if he had expected this question. Because you're smart enough to evaluate the alternatives, he said. Stay here, and you'll be dead within 2 weeks from cold, infection, or starvation. Try to make it in town, and you'll face the same fate slightly slower. Come with me, and you've got a fighting chance to see spring. He pulled a small metal object from his pocket and tossed it to land near her feet. Emma picked it up and found herself holding a derringer's small butt. Deadly, the kind of weapon a woman could conceal easily and use effectively at close range. Insurance, Marcus explained. You keep that with you at all times. If I ever do anything that makes you feel unsafe, use it. I'm betting you won't need to, but the option's there if you want it. Emma stared at the weapon, overwhelmed by the implications of what he was offering. Trust was a luxury she had learned to do without, but the alternative to trusting Marcus Thompson appeared to be certain death from exposure or disease. Why? She asked quietly. Why would you take such a risk for someone you don't know? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks that surrounded the valley. Had a sister once, he said finally. About your age when she died. Consumption, same as what took a lot of folks around here. Spent her last months coughing up blood and getting thinner every day, but she never complained, never gave up hope. That things would get better. His voice carried a note of pain that suggested old wounds not entirely healed. Couldn't do anything to save her. Couldn't even make her comfortable at the end. Been carrying that helplessness around for 15 years now, wondering what I might have done different if I'd been stronger or smarter, or just more determined. He looked back at Emma, his expression serious but not pitying. Can't bring her back, but I can make sure someone else's sister doesn't die alone in a drafty cabin when there's room by my fire. The explanation was both deeply personal and utterly practical, offering insight into Marcus's motivations without making Emma feel like an object of charity. She found herself studying his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda, but seeing only the quiet sincerity of someone who had made a difficult decision and was prepared to follow through on it. I'd want to see this cabin first, she said carefully. Make sure it's what you say it is. Marcus smiled for the first time since their conversation began, the expression transforming his weathered features and revealing genuine warmth beneath his serious exterior. Wouldn't expect anything less. We can head up there today if you're feeling up to the walk. 15 miles through mountain terrain might be challenging with that arm, but it's better to make the trip now than wait for the weather to get worse. Emma looked down at her infected wound, then back at the provisions Marcus had left on the ground. The smart choice was obvious, even if it required trusting a stranger with her life. The alternative was a slow, cold death that would serve no purpose, except to prove her independence. I'll need to gather my things, she said, decision made. Take whatever you can carry, Marcus agreed. Anything you leave behind will be buried under snow within a week anyway. As Emma turned toward her cabin to collect her meager possessions, she felt a strange mixture of terror and hope that she hadn't experienced in years. She was about to bet her life on the word of a mountain man who had appeared out of nowhere with promises of safety and comfort. But for the first time since her parents' deaths, someone was offering her a future that extended beyond mere survival. Marcus Thompson might be her salvation, or he might be the most dangerous predator she had ever encountered. Either way, Emma Walsh was about to find out which one, and discover what lay waiting for her in the high country where winter ruled with absolute authority and secrets could be buried as deep as the snow. The climb into the Colorado Rockies began deceptively easy, following a well-worn trail that miners had carved into the mountainside decades earlier during the silver boom. Emma walked behind Marcus, her few possessions wrapped in a bundle that seemed pathetically small compared to the enormity of the decision she had just made. The morning air was crisp, but not yet bitter, and for the first hour, she almost managed to convince herself that 15 miles through mountain terrain might be manageable despite her weakened condition. That optimism died quickly as the trail began to climb in earnest. By the third mile, Emma's lungs were burning from the thin mountain air, and the infected wound on her arm had begun to throb. With each step, Marcus maintained a steady pace that would have been comfortable for someone in good health, but for a 17-year-old girl who had been surviving on scraps for months, it quickly became a test of pure willpower over physical limitation. Need to rest? Marcus asked during one particularly steep section. His breathing barely labored despite the altitude and pace. Emma's pride warred with her practical need for recovery time. "I'm fine," she managed between gasps, though they both knew it was a lie. Marcus studied her flushed face and the way she favored her injured arm, then pointed to a flat boulder beside the trail. "I could use a drink myself," he said diplomatically, settling onto the rock and pulling a metal canteen from his pack. Emma gratefully sank down beside him, trying to hide how much her hands were shaking from exhaustion. The view from their resting spot was spectacular. The entire Millbrook Valley spread out below them like a detailed map, with the town looking like a collection of toy buildings surrounded by geometric patches of cultivated land. "How often do you make this trip?" Emma asked, accepting the canteen Marcus offered and trying not to gulp the water too desperately. "Maybe once a month during good weather, less often when snow's on the ground," Marcus replied. "Usually stock up on supplies in bulk, so I don't have to make the journey more than necessary." Emma tried to imagine what it would be like to live in such complete isolation, cut off from human contact for weeks at a time. "Don't you get lonely up there?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks that rose like cathedral spires against the pale sky. "Loneliness and solitude aren't the same thing," he said finally. "Solitude's a choice, gives you space to think, to work, to become whoever you're meant to be without other people's expectations weighing you down." He glanced at Emma, noting the way she was unconsciously cradling her injured arm. "Loneliness is what happens when you're surrounded by people who don't see you, don't understand you, or don't care enough to try. I'd rather be alone by choice than lonely in a crowd." The observation struck Emma as profoundly accurate to her own experience. Despite being surrounded by the townspeople of Millbrook Valley, she had felt utterly isolated, invisible except when her presence reminded others of their own vulnerabilities. "What made you choose the mountains?" she asked, genuinely curious about this man who had appended her world with a simple offer of partnership. Marcus stood and shouldered his pack, indicating their rest was over. "Started out mining like most folks who end up in these parts. Thought I'd strike it rich and go back to civilization with enough money to live like a king." They resumed walking, the trail now winding through stands of pine and aspen that created a natural windbreak against the increasingly cold air. "Found some silver, enough to keep me going for a few years, but I also found something else up here, peace. Quiet that goes bone deep, stars so bright they hurt your eyes, air so clean it makes you realize what you've been breathing down in." The valleys. Emma could understand the appeal, even as her city-raised sensibilities rebelled against the idea of such complete isolation. "What about when you get sick or injured or need help with something? Learn to be self-sufficient, or you don't survive," Marcus replied matter-of-factly. "Mountains don't care about your problems or your excuses. They'll kill you as quickly for being unprepared as for being unlucky. But they're honest about it, no false promises, no hidden motives, no sudden changes of heart that leave you worse off than before." The conversation was interrupted by the first snowflakes of the day, large wet flakes that stuck to their clothing and began accumulating on the trail ahead of them. Marcus looked up at the rapidly darkening sky with obvious concern. "Storm's moving in faster than I expected," he said, quickening his pace. "We need to reach the cabin before this gets serious." Emma tried to match his increased speed, but her body was already operating at the limits of its depleted reserves. The wound on her arm had begun bleeding again, seeping through her makeshift bandage and staining her sleeve with fresh crimson. Dizziness came in waves that made the trail seem to tilt and shift beneath her feet. "Marcus," she called out when the distance between them began to widen dangerously. "I can't." She never finished the sentence. The combination of exhaustion, blood loss, and the sudden drop in barometric pressure that accompanied the approaching storm overwhelmed her system. All at once, Emma felt her knees buckle, and then the world tilted sideways as she collapsed beside the trail dot when consciousness returned. She was moving through a landscape of swirling white, wrapped in something warm and dry that smelled of pine smoke and leather. It took several moments for her to realize that Marcus was carrying her, his long stride eating up the mountain trail with steady determination despite the additional burden of her weight. "Put me down," she mumbled against his shoulder, though. Her protest lacked conviction. "In about 2 miles," Marcus replied without breaking stride. "When we reach the cabin and get you properly warmed up and fed." Emma wanted to argue, to insist on maintaining her independence, but the warmth of his body heat and the security of being carried by someone strong enough to handle both her weight and the treacherous trail proved overwhelmingly seductive. For the first time in 4 years, she allowed herself to depend on someone else's strength instead of her own. The snow was falling heavily now, reducing visibility to mere yards and transforming the familiar mountain landscape into an alien wilderness of white. Emma could feel the temperature dropping rapidly, turning her breath to vapor and making her grateful for Marcus's decision to carry her rather than risking her slower pace in increasingly dangerous conditions. "There," Marcus said after what felt like hours but was probably less than 40 minutes. Emma raised her head from his shoulder to see a structure that defied every assumption she had made about mountain cabins. Instead of the crude shanty she had been expecting, Marcus's home was a substantial log building with a stone foundation, a steep pitched roof designed to shed snow, and windows that spoke of both prosperity and permanence. Smoke was rising from a brick chimney, suggesting that Marcus had arranged for the cabin to be warmed in advance of their arrival. The whole structure radiated competence and careful planning, the work of someone who understood mountain conditions and had built accordingly. "It's beautiful," Emma said softly, and meant it. Marcus carried her up the stone steps to a covered porch that ran the length of the cabin's front wall. "Built it myself over 3 summers," he said with understated pride. "Used timber from my own land, stone from the creek bed, hardware ordered from Denver, and hauled up here by mule train." The interior of the cabin was even more impressive than the exterior. A large main room dominated the space, with a massive stone fireplace providing both heat and light. The furniture was clearly handmade, but showed remarkable craftsmanship. Chairs that looked comfortable as well as sturdy, a dining table that could seat 6 people, shelves lined with books and carefully organized supplies that Marcus set Emma down gently in a chair beside the fireplace, then immediately busied himself building up the fire and preparing what appeared to be a substantial meal. Emma watched him move around the space with practiced efficiency, noting the way he seemed to anticipate every need and have a solution ready at hand. "This isn't a cabin," she said after several minutes of observation. "This is a house. A real house, better than most of what's down in the valley." Marcus glanced up from the pot he was stirring over the fire. "Spent 8 years getting it right," he admitted. "Trial and error, mostly, but I had time to fix my mistakes and improve on what worked." Emma looked around the room with new appreciation, noting details that spoke of long-term planning and considerable investment. You could live down in town with a place like this. Open a business, have neighbors, be part of a community. "Could," Marcus agreed, ladling stew into a wooden bowl and bringing it to her along with a chunk of fresh bread. "Question is why I'd want to." The food was better than anything Emma had tasted in months, rich with meat and vegetables, seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, substantial enough to satisfy genuine hunger rather than simply staving off starvation. She ate slowly, savoring each bite while processing the implications of Marcus's living situation. This wasn't the crude survival shelter of a hermit, or the temporary accommodation of someone planning to return to civilization eventually. This was the carefully constructed home of someone who had found exactly where he belonged and had built accordingly. "Why did you really ask me to come here?" Emma asked when her immediate hunger had been satisfied. And don't tell me it's because I remind you of your sister. This place, this life you've built, you didn't create all this just to share it with a stranger out of kindness. Marcus settled into the chair across from her, his own bowl balanced on his knees. Fair question, he said after a moment's consideration. Truth is, I've been thinking for a while that this place feels too big for one person. Not the physical space, but the purpose of it. He gestured around the room with obvious affection. Built it to last, to be a real home instead of just shelter. But a home's meant to be shared, to be filled with conversation and laughter, and the kind of daily routines that make life meaningful instead of just survivable. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implications of his words. You're looking for a wife. I'm looking for a partner, Marcus corrected gently. Someone who understands that building something worthwhile takes time and effort and commitment. Someone who won't see this mountain as a prison, but as a foundation for whatever we might create together. The honesty of his answer was both thrilling and terrifying. Emma had spent so long focused on simple survival that the idea of planning for an actual future seemed almost fantastical. But sitting in this warm, well-built home with food in her stomach and a man who spoke of partnership rather than rescue, she began to understand that maybe survival had been preparing her for something larger. Outside, the storm was intensifying, but inside Marcus's cabin, Emma Walsh was beginning to glimpse the possibility of a life beyond mere endurance, a future built on mutual respect, shared labor, and the kind of deep contentment that came from creating something permanent in an uncertain world. Emma woke to the sound of someone chopping wood outside, a rhythmic thudding that spoke of practiced efficiency and considerable strength. Sunlight was streaming through windows that were cleaner than any glass she had seen in years, casting geometric patterns across a quilt that was both beautiful and obviously handmade. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she had gotten there. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, the climb, the collapse, Marcus carrying her through the snowstorm to this remarkable cabin that defied every assumption she had made about mountain living. She was lying in a real bed, between clean sheets, wearing a flannel nightgown that was far too large for her frame, but wonderfully warm. The infected wound on her arm had been properly cleaned and bandaged with what appeared to be actual medical supplies rather than torn fabric. When she cautiously flexed her fingers, the sharp pain that had been her constant companion for days was reduced to a manageable ache. You're awake, Marcus's voice came from the doorway, where he stood with an armload of split pine logs. How are you feeling? Emma pulled the quilt up to her chin, suddenly conscious of being in a strange man's home wearing his clothing. Better, she admitted. My arm doesn't hurt as much. Honey and willow bark tea, Marcus explained, moving to build up the fire in the small cast-iron stove that heated the bedroom. Old remedy my grandmother used for infections. Seems to be working. Emma watched him work, noting the care he took to ensure the fire would burn evenly and provide steady heat. Everything he did seemed thoughtful and deliberate, the actions of someone who had learned to do things right the first time rather than rushing and making mistakes. How long was I asleep? She asked. About 14 hours, Marcus replied, closing the stove door and adjusting the damper. Storm blew through around midnight, left us with about 2 feet of new snow, but it's clear now. Beautiful morning. The casual way he mentioned 14 hours of unconsciousness suggested that Emma's body had been even more depleted than she had realized. She tried to remember the last time she had slept so deeply or for so long and couldn't. I should get up, she said, though the prospect of leaving the warm bed was distinctly unappealing. Help with breakfast, start earning my keep. Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. Your keep for the first week is getting healthy enough to actually be helpful instead of collapsing on mountain trails. After that, we'll talk about division of labor. The kindness in his voice was almost harder to accept than charity would have been. Emma had grown accustomed to transactions based on immediate exchange work for food, information for protection, compliance, for safety. The idea of being cared for without immediate reciprocation felt dangerous, like accepting a debt she might not be able to repay. "I don't like being useless," she said, more sharply than she had intended. "Neither do I," Marcus replied mildly. "Which is why I spent yesterday evening making a list of everything that needs doing around here before winter really sets in. Plenty of work for both of us once you're strong enough to handle it." Emma felt some of her tension ease at the practical nature of his response. A list of tasks was something she could understand and work with, unlike the murky territory of indefinite gratitude and obligation. "Can I see the list?" Marcus reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper covered with neat handwriting. "Food preservation, mending and winter clothing preparation, firewood processing, cabin maintenance, and about a dozen other projects that I've been putting off because they're easier with two people." Emma scanned the list, her eyes widening as she took in the scope of what he had planned. Smoking meat, canning vegetables, making candles, waterproofing boots, checking and repairing the cabin's chinking was the kind of comprehensive preparation that separated those who survived mountain winters from those who merely endured them. "This is a lot of work," she observed. "It is," Marcus agreed. "But it's also the difference between spending the winter worried about running out of supplies and spending it comfortable and secure. I've got most of the materials and tools we need, but some of these jobs really require 4 hands instead of 2. Emma studied the list more carefully, noting that many of the tasks aligned with skills she had learned during her years of hardscrabble survival. Food preservation, mending, basic maintenance. These were things she could do well, given proper materials and tools. "When do we start?" she asked. "Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it," Marcus replied. "Today, you rest and let that infection finish clearing up. Tonight, we plan how to tackle everything most efficiently." The next few hours passed in a strange but pleasant routine that Emma hadn't experienced since her parents' deaths. Marcus brought her meals that were both nutritious and flavorful, checked on her bandages with the competence of someone who had dealt with injuries before, and engaged her in conversations that ranged from practical concerns about winter preparation to broader discussions about books, ideas, and the world beyond the mountains. Emma found herself revealing details about her life that she had never shared with anyone, not just the obvious facts of her orphan state and years of poverty, but her thoughts about the books she had managed to read, her observations about human nature learned through desperate circumstances, and her dreams about what life might be like if basic survival wasn't a constant concern. Marcus, in turn, shared stories about his 8 years in the mountains, the challenges he had faced and overcome, and the gradual process by which he had transformed from a desperate prospector into a man who had found contentment in solitude and self-sufficiency. His tales were neither boastful nor self-deprecating, simply honest accounts of someone who had learned difficult lessons and applied them to create something valuable. By evening, Emma felt strong enough to join Marcus at the main table for dinner, though she still tired easily and found herself grateful for the support of a well-made chair. The meal was elaborate by her recent standards: roasted venison with root vegetables, fresh bread with butter, and coffee that was actually hot and properly brewed. "Tomorrow we start with food preservation," Marcus said as they ate. "I've got a deer and an elk hanging in the cold cellar that need to be processed, plus vegetables from my garden that won't keep much longer without proper preservation." Emma nodded, already mentally organizing the tasks involved. "Smoking, salting, and canning. Do you have adequate equipment?" "Built a smokehouse my 2nd year here, and I've got a good selection of crocks and jars for canning. What I don't have is someone who knows the proper techniques for making sure everything's done safely." "I can handle that," Emma said with confidence. My mother taught me food preservation before she died, and I've had to make do with whatever I could scavenge. Since then, I know how to make a little food go a long way." Marcus's expression grew thoughtful. "There's something else we need to discuss," he said carefully. "Living arrangements." Emma felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. This was the conversation she had been dreading, the moment when Marcus would reveal whatever expectations he had about their relationship beyond the practical partnership he had described. "The cabin's got 2 bedrooms, Marcus continued, apparently unaware of her internal tension. "You're welcome to keep using the one you slept in last night. It's got good light, stays warm, and there's a lock on the door if that makes you more comfortable." Emma blinked in surprise. "You're not expecting. That is, you don't want." "I want a partner, not a servant or a possession," Marcus said firmly. "Whatever develops between us, it'll be because we both choose it freely, not because you feel obligated or trapped." The relief Emma felt was so intense it was almost physical. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't thank me for treating you like a human being," Marcus replied. "That should be the minimum expectation, not something worth gratitude." They spent the rest of the evening planning their work schedule and discussing the logistics of various preservation methods. Emma found herself impressed not just by Marcus's thoroughness, but by his willingness to defer to her expertise in areas where she clearly knew more than he did. As she prepared for bed in her own room, a concept that felt almost impossibly luxurious after years of sleeping wherever she could find temporary shelter, Emma reflected on the strangeness of her situation. 24 hours ago, she had been a starving girl fighting dogs for scraps behind a bakery. Tonight, she was a partner in a mountain homestead, with meaningful work ahead of her and the promise of security through the brutal winter months. The transformation felt too dramatic to be real, too good to be trusted completely. But as she settled into the comfortable bed and listened to the wind moving through the pine trees outside her window, Emma allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her long struggle for survival had prepared her for something better than mere endurance. Outside, the mountain night was crisp and star-filled, beautiful in its harsh clarity. Inside the cabin, 2 people who had found each other by chance were beginning to discover that partnership might offer rewards neither had dared to imagine when they were facing the world alone. The smokehouse stood 20 yards from the main cabin, a sturdy log structure that Marcus had built during his 3rd year on the mountain. Emma examined it with the critical eye of someone who had learned to evaluate every resource for its potential to sustain life. The construction was solid, the ventilation properly designed, and the interior racks showed the kind of thoughtful engineering that would allow for efficient processing of large quantities of meat. "You built this yourself?" she asked, running her hand along the smooth-fitted joints that held the structure together. "Trial and error," Marcus replied, hauling a quarter of elk from the cold cellar where it had been hanging. "First version caught fire, second one didn't draw properly, and filled up with smoke instead of ventilating it. This is the 3rd attempt." Emma nodded approvingly. The willingness to learn from mistakes and improve was a trait she respected deeply, having learned through brutal experience that stubbornness in the face of failure could be fatal and unforgiving. Environments. They worked in companionable silence for the first hour, Marcus cutting the meat into strips while Emma prepared the brine solution that would cure it before smoking. The rhythm of shared labor felt natural in a way that surprised them, both 2 people who had grown accustomed to solitary work, discovering that collaboration could multiply effectiveness rather than simply dividing tasks. "Your knife work is excellent," Emma observed, watching Marcus reduce a large roast into uniform strips with practiced efficiency. "Where did you learn butchering?" "Same place I learned most things, necessity and repetition," Marcus replied. "Made a lot of mistakes in the early years, wasted good meat through poor technique. Now I can process a whole elk and use every part of it." Emma began arranging the cut meat in the brine, her movements economical and sure. My father taught me the basics, but I learned the finer points during my first winter on the streets. Found a job helping old Mrs. Patterson process chickens for her boarding house, worked for meals, and a place to sleep in her root cellar. The casual mention of sleeping in a root cellar during winter made Marcus pause in his cutting. How old were you? 14, Emma replied matter-of-factly. It was warmer than being outside, and Mrs. Patterson was fair about payment. Fed me twice a day and never tried to take advantage. Marcus absorbed this information quietly, adding it to his growing understanding of the experiences that had shaped Emma's character. Each story she shared revealed new depths of resilience and adaptability that impressed him more than any formal education or social accomplishment could have. By midday, they had filled the smokehouse with properly prepared meat and begun the slow-burning fire that would transform it into food that could last months without spoilage. Emma stood back to examine their work, satisfaction evident in her expression. This will feed us well into spring, she said, even accounting for the increased caloric needs of winter work. You've done this calculation before, Marcus observed. Every day for the past 4 years, Emma replied. When you're never sure where your next meal is coming from, you learn to think in terms of calories, nutrition, and how long various foods will sustain you under different conditions. They moved on to vegetable preservation, working in Marcus's garden to harvest the last crops before killing frost could claim them. Emma proved to have an encyclopedic knowledge of which vegetables could be stored fresh, which required processing, and the optimal methods for extending their useful life. These turnips will keep in the root cellar until March if we layer them properly with sand, she explained, demonstrating the technique. Carrots can go even longer if the humidity is right. But the cabbage needs to be made into sauerkraut within the next few days, or we'll lose it to spoilage. Marcus watched her work with growing amazement. This was knowledge that went far beyond basic survival. It was the accumulated wisdom of someone who had learned to extract maximum value from every resource, to waste nothing, and to plan ahead despite uncertain circumstances. You know more about food preservation than most farm wives, he said. Emma looked up from the turnip she was carefully arranging, a flush of pride coloring her cheeks. I've had good teachers and strong motivation to pay attention. Mistakes in food storage can kill you just as dead as mistakes in anything else. As afternoon faded toward evening, they tackled the complex process of making sauerkraut, a task that required precise timing and careful attention to fermentation conditions. Emma took the lead, her hands moving with practiced confidence as she shredded cabbage and calculated salt ratios. The key is maintaining the right balance, she explained, massaging salt into the shredded vegetables. Too little salt and it spoils, too much and it won't ferment properly. Temperature matters. Too needs to be cool enough to ferment slowly, but not so cold that the process stops entirely. Marcus found himself fascinated not just by her knowledge, but by the way she explained complex processes in clear, logical terms. There was a natural teaching ability in how she broke down complicated tasks into understandable components. Where did you learn the science behind fermentation? He asked. Dr. Morrison's medical texts, Emma replied, continuing her methodical preparation. He threw them out when he moved his practice to Denver, and I retrieved them from behind his office. Spent that whole winter reading everything I could understand about chemistry, biology, and medicine. The image of a homeless teenager teaching herself science from discarded medical textbooks by candlelight was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Marcus began to understand that Emma's survival had depended not just on physical resilience, but on intellectual curiosity and the ability to synthesize knowledge from disparate sources. As they packed the salted cabbage into crocks and weighted it down for proper fermentation, Emma's movements became increasingly precise and confident. This was work she understood completely, tasks where her expertise was not just valuable, but essential for success. You're enjoying this, Marcus observed. Emma paused in her work, considering his words. I am, she said with some surprise. I haven't had the luxury of enjoying work in years. It's always been about immediate survival, doing whatever was necessary to get through another day. But this feels different. How so? This is work that builds towards something, Emma explained. Every jar we fill, every piece of meat we smoke, it's creating security for the future. Making sure we'll not just survive winter, but be comfortable and well fed. Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. It's the difference between subsistence and prosperity. Exactly, Emma agreed. For the first time since my parents died, I'm working toward abundance instead of just fighting off starvation. As darkness fell and they moved inside to continue their planning by lamplight, Emma found herself explaining various preservation techniques with the enthusiasm of someone who finally had an audience for knowledge she had accumulated through necessity. Marcus listened intently, asking intelligent questions and offering insights from his own experience. We should start drying herbs tomorrow, Emma suggested, consulting the list of tasks they had created. I noticed you have a good variety growing wild around the property, plants that could be valuable for both cooking and medicine. I've been harvesting some basic ones, Marcus admitted, but I suspect you know which ones I've been overlooking. Emma smiled. I know plants that can treat everything from headaches to infected wounds. Give me a day to survey what's available, and I can put together a medicine chest that would rival anything Dr. Morrison had in his practice. The conversation that followed ranged from botanical medicine to food chemistry, from practical preservation techniques to the broader principles of sustainable living. Emma discovered that Marcus was not just a skilled craftsman and competent outdoorsman, but also an intelligent man who appreciated both theoretical knowledge and practical application. You could have been a teacher, Marcus said during a discussion about plant identification. You have a gift for making complex subjects understandable. Emma felt a familiar pang at the mention of paths not taken. Teachers need formal education and social standing. Neither was available to someone in my circumstances. Formal education is just one way to acquire knowledge, Marcus countered. You've learned more about practical science through necessity than most people learn in years of schooling. As they prepared to retire for the evening, Emma reflected on the unexpected satisfaction she had found in the day's work. For the first time in years, her knowledge and skills had been valued for their own merit, rather than simply as means of immediate survival. Marcus's respect for her abilities was evident in how he deferred to her expertise, asked for her opinions, and integrated her suggestions into their planning. He treated her as an equal partner rather than a rescued waif, and that recognition transformed the nature of their collaboration from charity into genuine partnership. Tomorrow we'll start on the herb gathering, Emma said as they banked the fire for the night. I want to have everything properly dried and stored before the snow gets too deep. Sounds like a plan, Marcus agreed. Though I suspect by the time you're finished, I'll know more about mountain plants than I learned in 8 years of living here. Emma smiled at the prospect. Teaching Marcus about botanical medicine would give her another opportunity to demonstrate her value as a partner, while also ensuring that their mountain homestead would be as self-sufficient as possible when winter isolation made outside help impossible. As she settled into her bed that night, Emma marveled at how much her circumstances had changed in just a few days. She was no longer the starving girl fighting dogs for scraps. She was becoming a true partner in building something substantial and lasting, using knowledge and skills that finally had proper value in application. 3 weeks into November, the sky turned the color of old pewter, and the air carried a sharp bite that spoke of serious weather moving in from the high peaks. Emma woke to find Marcus already stoking the fires and checking their supplies with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that mountain storms could trap people for days or even weeks. How bad? She asked, joining him at the kitchen window where they could see the distant mountains disappearing behind walls of gray cloud. Bad enough, Marcus replied, not looking away from the ominous sky. Barometer's been dropping for 2 days, and the wind's shifting to come down from the northwest. Old-timers say that combination means a storm that'll bury everything under several feet of snow. Emma felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. Not the rational concern of someone preparing for challenging weather, but the deep, instinctive fear of someone who had nearly died from exposure too many times to count. Winter storms had been her greatest enemy during her years on the streets, the force that had come closest to claiming her life on multiple occasions. How long before it hits? She asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the memories crowding her mind. 6 hours, maybe 8, Marcus estimated. Long enough to make final preparations if we work efficiently. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as they moved through their storm preparation checklist with practiced coordination. Extra firewood was stacked inside the cabin. Water barrels were filled and positioned where they wouldn't freeze, and all the preserved food was moved to easily accessible locations. Emma found herself taking charge of preparing emergency medical supplies, using her botanical knowledge to organize tinctures, poultices, and dried herbs that might be needed if injury or illness struck during their isolation. Marcus watched her work with obvious admiration for her systematic approach and comprehensive understanding of what might be required. "You think like a doctor," he observed, noting how she had arranged everything for quick access in low-light conditions. "I've had to be my own doctor too many times," Emma replied, checking the seals on containers holding powdered willow bark. "Learned that being prepared for medical emergencies is the difference between surviving an injury and dying from complications." By midday, the first snowflakes were beginning to fall, not the gentle, drifting snow of autumn, but hard, driven flakes that struck the windows with audible impacts. The wind was picking up steadily, and the temperature was dropping so rapidly that Emma could see the difference between the warmth near the fireplace and the growing cold near the windows. "Storms ahead of schedule," Marcus said, watching the rapidly deteriorating conditions outside. "We're going to be in this for at least 3 days, maybe longer." Emma nodded, mentally reviewing their preparations and finding them adequate. 3 days of confinement would be manageable. Their food supplies were excellent. They had enough fuel to keep warm, and the cabin was solid enough to withstand even severe weather. What she hadn't anticipated was how the enforced intimacy of being trapped together would affect the careful balance they had established in their partnership. The first day passed comfortably enough. They spent the morning completing indoor tasks that had been waiting for bad weather, mending clothes, organizing supplies, and updating the detailed records Marcus kept of everything from food consumption to weather patterns. Emma discovered that he was naturally methodical and had been documenting his mountain life with the precision of a scientist conducting research. 8 years of weather observations, she said, paging through notebooks filled with daily temperature readings, precipitation measurements, and wind direction records. "This is incredibly valuable data. Started keeping records my first winter," Marcus explained. "Figured if I was going to survive up here long term, I needed to understand the patterns, know what to expect and when." Emma studied the charts and graphs he had created, noting correlations between weather patterns and seasonal changes that revealed a deep understanding of mountain meteorology. "You could publish this. Scientific journals would be interested in long-term weather data from this elevation." Marcus looked pleased but skeptical. Doubt anyone would care about the observations of an unschooled mountain man. "Intelligence isn't determined by formal schooling," Emma said firmly. "This represents genuine scientific methodology and careful observation over an extended period. That has value regardless of who collected it." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden increase in wind intensity that made the cabin creak and groan around them. Snow was now falling so heavily that they couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the windows. and the temperature outside had dropped below 0. Emma found herself unconsciously moving closer to the fireplace, memories of frozen nights threatening to overwhelm her hard-won composure. Marcus noticed her subtle retreat and correctly interpreted its meaning. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "This cabin's weathered storms worse than this one. The foundation goes down 4 feet, the walls are double-chinked, and we've got enough fuel to keep warm for weeks if necessary." Emma nodded, intellectually understanding that their situation was secure while emotionally still fighting the learned responses of someone who had survived too many winters without adequate shelter. "I know. It's just memories. Want to talk about it?" Emma considered the question, weighing her habitual privacy against the intimacy that their isolation was creating. "The first winter after my parents died, I nearly froze to death in a storm like this one. Found shelter in an abandoned barn, but it had so many gaps in the walls that the snow drifted right through. Spent 3 days huddled under a pile of moldy hay, too weak from hunger to maintain my own body heat." Marcus listened without interruption, his expression grave but not pitying. "How did you survive?" "Old dog wandered in on the second day, probably. Looking for the same shelter I was. We ended up sharing body heat, curled up together under that hay pile until the storm passed." Emma smiled slightly at the memory. "Never knew what happened to that dog after the weather cleared, but I probably owe my life to it." "Animals understand survival better than most humans," Marcus observed. "They don't let pride or social expectations interfere with doing what's necessary to stay alive." The conversation that followed ranged from survival stories to broader discussions about the psychology of endurance, the way extreme circumstances revealed character, and the different strategies people use to maintain hope in desperate situations. Emma found herself sharing experiences she had never spoken about before, while Marcus revealed aspects of his own background that explained his choice to seek solitude in the mountains. "Had a business partner once down in Denver," Marcus said, "during a lull in the storm's intensity. Thomas Mitchell, smart man, good head for numbers. Seemed like someone I could trust to handle the financial side, while I focused on the actual mining work." Emma waited, sensing that this story would reveal something important about Marcus's past. Turned out he was skimming profits, falsifying reports, and selling our silver claims to competitors while telling me the mines were played out. By the time I discovered what he was doing, I'd lost everything: the claims, the equipment, 3 years of backbreaking work. "That's when you decided to come up here?" "Partly," Marcus admitted. "But mostly I realized that I preferred the honesty of dealing with mountains and weather over the complexity of trusting other people's motives. Up here, if something's going to kill you, it does it directly. No lies, no hidden agendas, no betrayal disguised as partnership." Emma understood the appeal of such clarity, having learned through her own bitter experience that people could be far more dangerous and unpredictable than natural hazards. "But now you're trying partnership again." Marcus looked at her thoughtfully. "With someone who's already proven she'd rather fight wild dogs than accept defeat. Someone whose word I can trust because I've seen her actions when everything was at stake." The compliment warmed Emma more than she had expected, recognition from someone whose respect she had come to value deeply. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Marcus replied firmly. "I know you keep your promises, work harder than anyone has. A right to expect, and refuse to give up even when circumstances seem hopeless. Those are the qualities that matter in a partner." As the second day of the storm continued, their conversations deepened further. Confined together in the warm cabin while the wind howled outside, they began to share not just stories and practical knowledge, but thoughts about life, purpose, and what constituted meaningful existence. Emma discovered that Marcus was not just intelligent and capable, but thoughtful in ways that suggested considerable depth of character. He asked perceptive questions about her experiences, offered insights that revealed genuine understanding of complex situations, and demonstrated the kind of emotional intelligence that made difficult conversations feel safe and productive. Marcus, for his part, found himself continually surprised by Emma's intellectual curiosity and analytical ability. She approached problems with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to engineering challenges, but combined it with intuitive understanding of human nature that he recognized as wisdom earned through adversity. By the third day, when the Zhou storm finally began to show signs of weakening, they had established a new level of intimacy that went beyond their practical partnership. It wasn't romantic, both were too careful and respectful for that, but it was the kind of deep friendship that formed when two people discovered they could trust each other completely. "Storm's breaking," Marcus announced late in the afternoon. Noting the subtle changes in wind direction and barometric pressure that indicated improving conditions, Emma joined him at the window, where they could see patches of blue sky beginning to appear between the gray clouds. The snow had stopped falling, and the wind was diminishing to occasional gusts rather than the constant howl that had surrounded them for days. "We'll need to dig out tomorrow," Marcus said, estimating the depth of snow that had accumulated around the cabin. "Check on the animals, make sure all our structures weathered the storm intact." Emma nodded, already mentally organizing the tasks that would be required. But part of her felt almost reluctant to see the storm end, to return to the normal rhythms of work that wouldn't require the intense cooperation and conversation that had characterized their confinement. "Marcus," she said as they prepared to bank the fire for the night. "Thank you." "For what?" "For making me feel like a person again, instead of just a survivor." Marcus was quiet for a moment, understanding the weight of what she was expressing. "Thank you for trusting me enough to let me see who you really are." Outside, the mountain night was crystal clear and bitter cold, with stars shining with the intense brilliance that only came after major storms had cleared the air completely. Inside the cabin, two people who had found unexpected depths in each other settled into sleep with the knowledge that their partnership had survived its first real test and emerged stronger than either had dared to hope. December arrived with deceptive calm, clear skies and moderate temperatures that lulled Emma into believing winter might be less brutal than Marcus had predicted. She had grown comfortable in their daily routines, tending the animals, processing stored food, maintaining the cabin's various systems, and continuing her education in mountain survival under Marcus's patient guidance. The illusion of security shattered on December 15th when Emma woke to the smell of smoke that wasn't coming from their carefully banked fireplace. "Marcus," she called, throwing on her coat and rushing outside to find the source of the acrid smell that was growing stronger by the minute. The smokehouse was ablaze. Flames were shooting through the roof, where a section of chinked logs had separated, allowing sparks from the smoking fire to ignite the dry timber above. 3 weeks' worth of preserved meat, their primary protein source for the entire winter, was about to be consumed by the very fire that was supposed to cure it. Marcus appeared at her side, carrying 2 water buckets and moving with the controlled urgency of someone who understood exactly how catastrophic the situation could become. "The snow," he shouted over the crackling flames. "We need to smother it before it spreads to the other buildings." Emma grabbed a shovel and began throwing snow onto the base of the fire while Marcus attacked the flames with water and a thick blanket he had soaked at the well. The work was frantic and dangerous. The structure was too hot to approach closely, and the wind was picking up in a way that threatened to carry burning embers to the main cabin or the animal shelters. "The meat," Emma gasped between shovelfuls of snow. "Can we save any of it?" "Not if we don't get this fire out first," Marcus replied grimly, dumping another bucket of water onto the flames and immediately running back toward the well to refill it. For 20 terrifying minutes, they fought the fire with everything they had. Emma's lungs burned from breathing smoke, her hands were numb from handling snow without gloves, and her heart hammered with the knowledge that failure meant potential starvation before spring arrived. This wasn't just a building burning, it was their survival margin going up in flames. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably less than half an hour. The last of the flames died down to smoldering embers that could be safely contained with snow. Emma and Marcus stood in the wreckage of their smokehouse, both breathing hard and covered in soot, surveying the damage by the pale light of a winter dawn. The structure was a total loss. Roof collapsed, walls charred and weakened beyond repair. Worse, most of their carefully preserved meat had been destroyed, either burned directly or contaminated by smoke and falling debris. What remained was barely enough to feed them for 2 weeks, let alone the remaining 4 months of winter. "How bad?" Emma asked quietly, though she could see the answer in Marcus's expression. "Bad," he admitted, poking through the debris with a stick to assess what might be salvageable. "We can save maybe 20 pounds of the elk, some of the venison. That was hanging near the door. Everything else is gone." Emma felt the familiar cold knot of fear forming in her stomach, not just concern about their immediate situation, but the deeper terror of someone who had experienced true hunger and knew exactly what starvation felt like as it slowly consumed a person from the inside out. Options? She managed, forcing herself to think strategically rather than succumbing to panic. Marcus straightened up, his face grim but determined. "We hunt, aggressively. Every day that weather permits, one of us needs to be tracking game. We also ration what preserved food we have left, stretch it as far as possible." "What about the nearest town? Could we make it down to Millbrook for supplies?" "Not until spring," Marcus said, shaking his head. "December through February. That trail's impassable except for someone with serious mountaineering experience. Winter equipment we don't have. We're committed to whatever we can find or catch up here." Emma nodded, accepting the reality of their isolation. "Then we hunt. What's available this time of year?" "Deer, elk if we're lucky, rabbits, maybe some. Winter birds. Problem is, animals are scarce once the deep cold sets in. They migrate to lower elevations or hole up in shelter. We might go days without seeing anything worth shooting." As they cleaned up the debris and salvaged what little meat they could, Emma's mind was already working through the mathematics of survival. 20 pounds of preserved meat, plus whatever fresh game they could catch, divided by 2 people over 4 months. It was possible, but only if they were both skilled and lucky. "I can help hunt," she said as they carried the salvaged meat back to the cabin for proper storage. Marcus looked skeptical. "Have you ever used a rifle?" "No, but I've caught rabbits with snares and trapped small birds. If large game is scarce, we'll need every calorie we can get from smaller sources." Over the next few days, as they dealt with the practical aftermath of the fire, Emma threw herself into learning hunting skills with the same systematic intensity she had brought to botanical medicine and food preservation. Marcus proved to be an excellent teacher, patient with her inexperience, but demanding about safety and accuracy. "Shooting's not just about hitting the target," he explained as they practiced with unloaded rifles in the cabin. "It's about understanding wind, distance, animal behavior, and having the patience to wait for the right shot. Wound an animal and lose it, and you've wasted ammunition we can't replace." Emma absorbed every lesson with desperate concentration. Her survival instincts, honed by years of scarcity, recognized that mastering these skills might mean the difference between life and death before spring arrived. Their first hunting expedition together came 3 days after the fire, when fresh snow revealed deer tracks leading up the valley toward a grove of pine trees that provided winter shelter. Emma carried Marcus's spare rifle, its weight unfamiliar but reassuring in her hands. "Remember," Marcus whispered as they approached the area where the tracks were freshest. "Slow movements, no sudden noises, and don't shoot unless you're certain of a clean kill." They spotted the deer, a young doe picking her way carefully through the snow-covered underbrush from a distance of about 60 yards. Marcus positioned himself for the shot while Emma watched and learned, noting how he controlled his breathing, calculated for wind drift, and waited for the animal to present the best possible target. The rifle's report echoed off the mountain. Walls like thunder, and the dough dropped cleanly with a single shot through the heart. Emma felt a complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and sadness as they approached their kill. Relief that they had secured food, gratitude for Marcus's skill, and sadness for the beautiful animal whose life had been necessary for their survival. "Clean kill," Marcus said with satisfaction, kneeling beside the deer to begin the field dressing process. "She didn't suffer, and we'll use every part of her." Emma watched the butchering process with clinical attention, memorizing each step, so she could perform it herself if necessary. This wasn't squeamishness about death. She had seen too much of it during her street years to be bothered by the sight of blood, but serious study of skills she might need to employ alone. "Why do you cut there first?" she asked as Marcus made his initial incision. "Proper field dressing preserves the meat and prevents spoilage," Marcus explained, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Do it wrong, and you can contaminate the entire carcass. Do it right, and you get clean, healthy meat that will feed us for weeks." They packed the dressed deer back to the cabin on a makeshift sled Marcus had constructed from pine boughs, and spent the rest of the day processing the meat into portions that could be preserved by the natural refrigeration of the mountain winter. Emma proved adept at the detailed work of trimming and packaging, her small hands perfect for the precision tasks that Marcus's larger fingers found awkward. "You're a natural at this," Marcus observed as Emma wrapped portions of venison in oilcloth. "Most people struggle with the butchering, but you handle it like you've been doing it for years." "I've cleaned plenty of small game," Emma replied. "Rabbits, birds, whatever I could catch during the lean times. The principles are the same, just bigger scale." As evening fell and they settled down to their first meal of fresh venison in weeks, Emma felt a cautious optimism about their prospects. The fire had been a disaster, but their response to it had revealed new capabilities and strengthened their partnership in ways that comfort and security never could have. "We'll get through this," she said, more to herself than to Marcus. "Yes, we will," Marcus agreed firmly. "But it's going to require everything we've got: skill, determination, and a fair amount of luck." Emma nodded, accepting the challenge. She had survived 4 years on the streets through a combination of those same qualities. Now, instead of fighting for survival alone, she had a partner who brought different skills and shared the burden of staying alive through the harsh mountain winter. Outside, the wind was beginning to pick up again, promising another storm. But inside the cabin, warmed by the fire and sustained by meat they had hunted together, Emma Walsh felt stronger and more capable than she had since her parents' deaths. The starving girl who had fought dogs for scraps was becoming someone who could face wilderness challenges with competence and courage. The test of fire had revealed not just their vulnerabilities, but their capacity to overcome disaster through partnership, skill, and unshakable determination to survive whatever the mountains could throw at them. January brought the kind of cold that made the air itself feel brittle, temperatures so low that breath froze instantly and exposed skin could suffer frostbite in minutes. Emma had never experienced anything like the bone-deep, relentless cold of a high-altitude winter, where even inside their well-built cabin, water left too close to the windows would freeze solid overnight. Their hunting had been moderately successful. Through December, 2 more deer, several rabbits, and a lucky encounter with an elk that had provided enough meat to ease their immediate fears about starvation. But January's brutal cold had driven most game to lower elevations or deep into whatever shelter they could find, leaving the mountains strangely empty of the wildlife they desperately needed to survive. Emma stood at the kitchen window on the morning of January 20th, watching snow fall in sheets so thick she couldn't see the barn 40 yards away. They had been snowed in for 6 days now, living on carefully rationed portions and hoping the storm would break before their remaining supplies ran critically low. "Blizzard's getting worse," Marcus said, joining her at the window with a cup of coffee that smelled better than it tasted. They had been stretching their coffee supplies with chicory root and roasted acorns for weeks now. How much food do we have left? Emma asked, though she had been doing the calculations herself every day and knew the answer wouldn't be encouraging. Maybe 2 weeks of full rations. A month if we cut portions to subsistence level, Marcus replied. Honestly, after that, we're looking at eating leather and tree bark to stay alive. Emma nodded grimly. She had eaten both during her worst periods on the streets, and while they could technically keep a person alive for a short time, they provided almost no nutrition and left the body consuming its own muscle and fat to maintain basic functions. The storm has to break eventually, she said, more to convince herself than Marcus. Eventually, yes. But eventually might be longer than we can afford to wait. Their conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both of them freeze, the sharp crack of splitting wood, followed by a rumbling noise that seemed to come from beneath their feet. Marcus was moving toward the door before the sound finished, echoing through the cabin. What was that? Emma called, grabbing her coat to follow him outside. Avalanche, Marcus said grimly, pulling on his heaviest boots, somewhere close from the sound of it. They fought their way through the driving snow to investigate, and what they found made Emma's heart sink to her boots. A massive slide of snow and debris had swept down from the ridge above them, carrying with it several large pine trees and thousands of tons of packed snow. The avalanche had missed their cabin by less than 50 yards, but it had completely buried the trail that led down the mountain towards civilization. We're cut off completely now, Marcus said, studying the enormity of the debris field. Even when the weather clears, it would take weeks with proper equipment to dig through that mess. Emma stared at the wall of snow and timber that now blocked their only route to the outside world. They had gone from isolated to completely trapped, with rapidly dwindling food supplies and no possibility of rescue or resupply until spring thaw. How long until the snow melts enough to clear a path? She asked. April, maybe May, Marcus replied. Depends on how warm the spring is and whether we get more slides that pile even more debris on top of what's already there. Emma did the mathematics in her head and felt her stomach clench with familiar fear. They had perhaps a month of food remaining, stretched to starvation levels, but they faced 3 more months of complete isolation. Even if they could catch some game, it wouldn't be enough to bridge such an enormous gap. We need to talk about this inside, Marcus said, noting how the wind was picking up and the snow was beginning to blow horizontally across the mountainside. Back in the warmth of the cabin, they spread out Marcus's detailed maps of the area and began discussing options that ranged from difficult to desperate to nearly impossible. There's an old mining camp about 15 miles northeast, Marcus said, pointing to a location marked on one of his hand-drawn charts. Abandoned for years, but some of the buildings might still be standing. If there are any preserved supplies left there. Quotes. Emma studied the route he was indicating. 15 miles through deep snow in winter conditions, with limited food for the journey. What are the chances of finding anything useful after all these years? Small, Marcus admitted, but better than sitting here and slowly starving to death. What about the other direction? South toward the valley? Marcus shook his head. That route's even worse, steeper terrain, more avalanche danger, and it would take us farther from any potential shelter or supplies. Emma traced the paths on the map with her finger, weighing their limited options. Both routes were desperate gambles that could easily result in death from exposure, exhaustion, or getting lost in terrain that was unforgiving even under ideal conditions. There's a third option, she said slowly, an idea forming that was both logical and terrifying. We split up. Marcus looked up sharply. Absolutely not. Listen to me, Emma pressed. One person can move faster, requires less food for the journey, and has a better chance of making it to the mining camp and back. If they find supplies, they can return and we both survive. If they don't make it back, then the person left behind dies alone, Marcus finished flatly. I won't consider it. You're being emotional instead of practical, Emma argued, though she felt the same instinctive resistance to the idea of separation. One of us has to try for those supplies. And you're the stronger traveler. I can maintain the cabin and survive longer on smaller rations. And if I don't make it back? If I get lost, or injured, or caught in another storm? Emma met his eyes steadily. Then I die knowing we tried everything possible instead of just giving up. The argument that followed was intense but civil, both of them recognizing that they were discussing life and death decisions that would affect not just their own survival but their responsibility to each other. Marcus's protective instincts rebelled against leaving Emma alone and potentially defenseless, while Emma's practical nature demanded that they pursue their best chance for survival, regardless of emotional complications. There's another factor you're not considering, Marcus said during a lull in their debate. What if something happens to you while I'm gone? What if you get sick or injured or the cabin catches fire? I'd come back to find ... He couldn't finish the sentence, but Emma understood what he was trying to say. The idea of returning to find her dead was as unbearable to him as the thought of him dying on the trail was to her. So what do you suggest? Emma asked. We just sit here and hope for a miracle? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if it might provide answers to their impossible situation. We try everything else first, he said finally. Ice fishing, setting every snare and trap we can make, hunting in weather that's barely survivable. We push ourselves to the absolute limit before we consider splitting up. Emma nodded, recognizing the wisdom of exhausting all other options before attempting their most desperate gamble. How long do we try the intensive hunting approach? 2 weeks, Marcus decided. If we haven't found significant food sources by then, I'll make the trip to the mining camp. We'll decide who goes based on who's in better condition to make the journey, Emma corrected firmly. This isn't about protecting me. It's about maximizing our chances of survival. Marcus looked as though he wanted to argue, but finally nodded grudging agreement. 2 weeks of everything we've got, then we reassess. The next morning, despite weather that was barely survivable, they began the most intensive hunting and foraging effort of their partnership. Marcus ventured out in conditions that would have been foolhardy under normal circumstances, tracking game through snow that was often waist-deep and fighting wind that could knock a person off their feet. Emma focused on ice fishing and small game trapping, using every technique she had learned during her street years and adapting them to mountain conditions. She fashioned fishhooks from bent nails, created snares from wire salvaged from abandoned mining equipment, and even attempted to catch birds using traps, baited with precious crumbs from their dwindling bread supply. Their efforts yielded minimal results: a few small fish, 2 rabbits, and 1 ptarmigan that Marcus managed to shoot during a brief clearing in the weather. It was food, but nowhere near enough to significantly impact their overall situation. By the end of their 2-week intensive effort, both of them were showing the effects of increased activity on reduced rations. Emma had lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and Marcus was moving with the careful economy of someone whose body was beginning to consume its own muscle mass for energy. Decision time, Marcus said on the 14th evening, as they sat by the fire sharing a meal that was more broth than substance. Emma studied his face in the firelight, noting the hollow cheeks and the way his clothes hung loose on his previously solid frame. You're not strong enough to make that journey, she said quietly. Neither are you. I'm smaller, need less food, and I'm used to functioning while malnourished, Emma pointed out. I also have more experience traveling in dangerous conditions with minimal supplies. Marcus wanted to argue, but the practical truth of her assessment was undeniable. Emma's years of street survival had taught her to function effectively under conditions that would incapacitate someone accustomed to regular meals and adequate shelter. If you don't make it back ... quotes Marcus began. Then you'll know I died trying to save us both, Emma finished. "And you'll have enough food to last until spring, maybe long enough for someone to discover the avalanche and come looking." The conversation continued late into the night, but by morning they had reached a decision that neither of them liked, but both recognized as their best chance for survival. Emma would make the journey to the abandoned mining camp, carrying minimal supplies and moving as quickly as conditions permitted. As she prepared for what might be the most dangerous undertaking of her life, Emma Walsh felt the familiar steel resolve that had carried her through every previous crisis. She was no longer the starving girl fighting dogs for scraps. She was a woman who had learned to do whatever was necessary to survive, and she would not let the mountain claim them without a fight. Emma left at dawn on February 3rd, carrying a pack that contained everything Marcus could spare for her journey: 3 days of food, basic medical supplies, emergency fire-starting materials, and the derringer he had given her months ago. The weight was minimal by necessity, but every ounce represented something they could ill afford to lose if she didn't return. 15 miles northeast to the mining camp, Marcus said for the dozenth time, his voice steady despite the fear they both felt. "Follow the ridgeline to avoid avalanche zones, and if you're not back in 5 days, I'll assume the worst and ration accordingly." Emma nodded, adjusting the snowshoes Marcus had crafted for her from bent wood and leather strips. "If I find supplies, I'll signal from the high point above the camp. 3 fires in a row, repeated 3 times. You should be able to see the smoke from here if the weather's clear." They embraced briefly, both understanding that this might be their final goodbye. Emma had calculated the odds of successfully completing this journey, and they weren't encouraging. But sitting in the cabin waiting for slow starvation wasn't a viable alternative. The first day of travel was brutal but manageable. Emma followed game trails when possible, broke her own path through deep snow when necessary, and maintained a steady pace that covered ground without exhausting her limited energy reserves. Her years of street survival had taught her to function efficiently while hungry, cold, and tired, skills that proved invaluable in the harsh mountain environment. The landscape around her was both beautiful and terrifying in its emptiness. Snow-covered peaks stretched endlessly in every direction, their silence broken only by the wind and the crunch of her snowshoes against the frozen surface. This was wilderness in its purest form, indifferent to human suffering, magnificent in its harsh clarity, and absolutely unforgiving of mistakes. She found shelter for the first night in a natural cave formation that provided protection from wind and a place to build a small fire for warmth. As she chewed slowly on a piece of dried meat and melted snow for drinking water, Emma allowed herself to think about Marcus back at the cabin, probably sitting by their fire and wondering if he would ever see her again. The thought of him waiting, worrying, counting the hours until her promised return, gave her strength that went beyond physical endurance. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival anymore, she was fighting for both of them, for the partnership they had built, and for the future they might still have together if she could complete this impossible journey. The second day brought worse weather, driving snow and wind that made navigation treacherous and visibility nearly zero. Emma was forced to rely on compass bearings and careful attention to terrain features to maintain her course toward the mining camp. Several times, she lost the trail entirely and had to backtrack to find landmarks she could recognize. The cold was beyond anything she had experienced, even during her worst winters on the streets. It penetrated through her layered clothing, made her lungs burn with every breath, and turned her extremities numb despite her best efforts to maintain circulation. But Emma pressed on, driven by the knowledge that turning back would mean certain death for both her and Marcus. By afternoon, exhaustion was making her clumsy and indecisive. She caught herself making the kind of small mistakes, misreading the compass, choosing poor routes, failing to notice dangerous terrain that could easily prove fatal in conditions where there was no margin for error. It was during one of these Moments of struggling through particularly deep snow that Emma heard something that made her freeze in terror. The low, rumbling growl of a mountain lion. The cat was perhaps 20 yards away, partially hidden behind a boulder but clearly aware of her presence. It was lean from the hard winter, its ribs visible beneath its thick coat, and it was studying her with the focused attention of a predator evaluating potential prey. Emma's hand moved slowly toward the derringer in her coat pocket, though she knew that if the mountain lion decided to attack, the small weapon would provide little protection. Her best chance lay in avoiding a confrontation entirely, backing away slowly while making herself appear as large and threatening as possible. "Easy," she whispered, more to calm herself than to communicate with the cat. "I'm not what you're looking for. Too much trouble, not enough meat." The standoff continued for several agonizing minutes, with the mountain lion watching her every movement while Emma tried to retreat without triggering an attack. She remembered every lesson Marcus had taught her about mountain predators: maintain eye contact, appear confident, never run unless you can reach guaranteed safety. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now facing down a mountain lion with more composure than she had once shown when confronting aggressive dogs over garbage scraps. The girl who had been helpless against street threats had become someone capable of handling wilderness dangers with calculated courage. Finally, perhaps, deciding that this particular prey wasn't worth the effort, the cat turned and disappeared into the snow-covered rocks with liquid grace. Emma waited another 10 minutes before continuing her journey, shaken by the encounter but grimly proud that she had handled the situation without panic. The abandoned mining camp appeared late on the third day, a cluster of dilapidated buildings, partially buried in snowdrifts. Emma approached cautiously, knowing that unstable structures could be as dangerous as any wild animal. Several of the buildings had collapsed entirely under snow loads, but a few appeared to have weathered the winter storms with their roofs and walls intact. The sight of human construction, even abandoned and deteriorating, felt surreal after 2 days of complete wilderness travel. These buildings represented the dreams and failures of men who had come to the mountains seeking fortune, found hardship instead, and eventually retreated back to easier lives at lower elevations. The first building she investigated, what had probably been the main office, yielded nothing useful except some rusty tools and papers too deteriorated to read. Mice had nested in what remained of the furniture, and the smell of decay was strong even in the frigid air. The second structure, a bunkhouse, contained rotted bedding and broken furniture, but no food or supplies. Emma searched methodically, checking every corner and crevice where precious items might have been cached, but found nothing that could help sustain human life. It was in the third building, a storage shed built into the hillside for protection from avalanches, that Emma found what she had been hoping for: canned goods, flour in sealed containers, dried beans, and even some preserved meat that had been protected from spoilage by the consistently cold temperatures. The supplies weren't abundant, perhaps enough food to sustain 2 people for 6 weeks, but they represented the difference between certain death and possible survival until spring thaw. Emma spent the rest of the daylight hours organizing everything into loads she could carry, calculating weights and distances to determine how much she could transport back to the cabin. Her hands shook as she handled each precious can and bag, not from cold, but from overwhelming relief. This cache of forgotten supplies would save their lives, would give them the margin they needed to survive until spring brought the possibility of hunting fresh game and gathering wild plants. As she worked, Emma allowed herself to imagine Marcus's face when she returned with proof that their desperate gamble had succeeded. The thought of his relief, his pride in her accomplishment, his joy at their renewed chances for survival, gave her energy that went beyond her physical reserves. That night, as she camped in the most intact building and prepared to signal Marcus with the promised fires, Emma allowed herself to feel cautious optimism for the first time in weeks. She had succeeded in the most dangerous undertaking of her life, found supplies that could save them both, and proven to herself that her transformation from helpless victim to capable survivor was complete and permanent. Building the signal fires required careful planning. She needed them visible from miles away while conserving her limited fuel supplies. Using dried wood scavenged from the collapsed buildings and arranging them on the highest point above the camp, Emma created 3 distinct blazes that would burn bright against the dark mountain night. The signal fires burned bright against the clear mountain night, 3 blazes arranged in a line and repeated 3 times as promised. From her elevated position, Emma could see for miles across the snow-covered landscape, and somewhere in that vast wilderness, Marcus would be watching for her signal and understanding that their gamble had paid off. Standing beside those fires, Emma felt a profound sense of completion that went beyond mere mission success. She had traveled alone through some of the most dangerous terrain in North America, faced down a mountain predator, located life-saving supplies, and managed every challenge through her own skills and determination. The scared, starving girl who had once fought dogs for garbage scraps could never have imagined this moment standing confidently in mountain wilderness, having successfully completed a journey that would challenge experienced outdoorsmen, holding the key to survival for herself and the man she had come to love. The return journey took 2 full days, with Emma carrying a pack that was nearly too heavy for her weakened condition, but contained enough food to justify the struggle. She had cached additional supplies at the mining camp, marking their location carefully so they could return for more if necessary. The weight of the pack was both burden and joy. Every step was more difficult, but every ounce represented security, survival, and the promise of a future beyond mere endurance. Emma paced herself carefully, resting when necessary but maintaining steady progress toward home. Home. The word carried new meaning now. It wasn't just the physical cabin where she and Marcus lived, but the life they had built together, the partnership that had sustained them through impossible challenges, and the love that had grown from mutual respect and shared struggle. When the cabin finally came into view on the afternoon of February 8th, Emma felt a surge of emotion that surprised her with its intensity. This wasn't just relief at completing a dangerous journey. It was the deep satisfaction of returning home to someone who mattered more to her than she had fully realized. Marcus must have been watching for her return, because he appeared at the cabin door before she had even reached the porch steps. His face showed the strain of 5 days spent wondering if she was alive or dead, worry lines that hadn't been there when she left, and eyes that searched her face and form for signs of injury or distress. When he saw the pack loaded with supplies, his expression transformed from worry to amazement to something that looked very much like pride and overwhelming relief. "You did it," he said simply, taking the pack from her shoulders and helping her inside to the warmth of the fire. His hands were gentle but urgent as he guided her to her favorite chair, immediately beginning the process of ensuring she was warm, fed, and cared for after her ordeal. "We did it," Emma corrected, settling gratefully into the familiar comfort and accepting the cup of hot broth Marcus immediately prepared for her. "This was only possible because you taught me everything I needed to know to survive out there." As she recounted the details of her journey, the challenges of navigation in bad weather, the mountain lion encounter, the systematic search of the abandoned buildings, the discovery of supplies, Marcus listened with the rapt attention of someone hearing about miraculous events. His questions were intelligent and concerned, focusing not just on what she had accomplished, but on how she had handled the various dangers and challenges. When she finished her account, he was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight. "Emma," he said finally, his voice carrying a weight of emotion that made her look up from her broth. "I need to tell you something important." Emma set down her cup, noting the serious tone in his voice and the way his expression had shifted from relief to something deeper and more vulnerable. "When you left for that mining camp, I realized something that should have been obvious months ago. Sitting here alone, wondering if you were alive or dead. Imagining what my life would be like if you never came back, it made me understand that what I feel for you goes far beyond gratitude or partnership. Marcus moved closer, his eyes never leaving her face. I've fallen in love with you, Emma, not just appreciative of your skills and character, not just grateful for your partnership and companionship, but genuinely, completely, irrevocably in love with who you are. Emma felt her heart begin beating faster, though she wasn't entirely surprised by his declaration. The feelings had been building between them for weeks, evident in small gestures and unspoken understandings that had deepened their partnership beyond mere survival cooperation. I realized the same thing out there, she admitted quietly, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt. When I thought I might not make it back, when I was facing that mountain lion or struggling through deep snow, the thing that hurt most wasn't the idea of dying, it was the thought that I'd never see you again, never have the chance to tell you how much you mean to me. Marcus moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his own larger ones. His calloused palms were warm and steady, anchoring her to this moment of truth between them. Emma, when spring comes and the trail opens up, we could go down to Millbrook, have a proper wedding, make this official in every way that matters. I want to build a real life with you, not just survive together, but thrive together, create something lasting and beautiful in this place we've made our home. Emma smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the hot broth. I'd like that very much, Marcus. But you should know, I'm not the same person you found fighting dogs for scraps behind that bakery. These months with you have changed me in ways I never thought possible. You've changed me too, Marcus replied, bringing her hands to his lips for a gentle kiss. Made me remember that isolation isn't the same thing as independence, that building something meaningful requires more than just surviving alone. You've shown me what real partnership looks like, two people making each other stronger instead of just sharing the burden. As February gave way to March and the worst of winter's grip began to loosen, Emma and Marcus settled into new rhythms that acknowledged both their practical partnership and their emotional connection. The additional supplies from the mining camp had eliminated their immediate survival concerns, allowing them to plan for spring and the future they would build together. Emma continued developing her knowledge of mountain living, but now with the confidence of someone who had proven herself capable of handling the most extreme challenges. She was no longer learning survival skills out of desperate necessity, but mastering them as foundations for a life she was choosing rather than simply enduring. She began teaching Marcus about botanical medicine with the authority of someone who had tested her knowledge under life or death conditions. Their evening conversations ranged from practical concerns about expanding their homestead to deeper discussions about their dreams, their values, and the kind of life they wanted to create together. Marcus, meanwhile, began sharing plans he had never discussed with anyone, ideas for expanding their homestead, developing sustainable systems that could support a family, creating something permanent and lasting in the high country that had become their sanctuary. He spoke of building additional structures, establishing larger gardens, perhaps even creating a small trading post where other mountain dwellers could obtain supplies and medical care. With Emma's knowledge and his building skills, they could create something unprecedented in the region, a true mountain community center. When the first green shoots began appearing through melting snow in early April, they made their journey down to Millbrook Valley together. The town that had once represented rejection and isolation for Emma now felt like a place they were visiting rather than somewhere either of them belonged. The transformation in how the townspeople viewed Emma was remarkable and immediate. Where once they had seen a ragged, desperate girl fighting for scraps, they now saw a confident, capable woman who carried herself with quiet dignity and obvious strength. Word of her heroic journey to save both their lives had spread through the small community, growing in the telling until she had become something of a local legend. The starving girl who had once been invisible to most residents was now someone they approached with respect and genuine admiration. "Miss Walsh," Mrs. Henderson said when they encountered her at Peterson's General Store. "I heard about your winter journey to that old mining camp. That was incredibly brave. Most men wouldn't have attempted such a thing." Emma accepted the praise graciously, but without false modesty. "Sometimes you do what's necessary to survive, regardless of whether it seems possible beforehand." The wedding took place in the small church where Emma had once hidden from winter storms, attended by townspeople who marveled at the transformation they witnessed. Reverend Morgan, who had been serving the community for 15 years, later said it was one of the most meaningful ceremonies he had ever performed. "We are gathered here today," the Reverend began, "to witness the union of two people who have already proven their commitment to each other through trials that would test the strongest bonds. Marcus and Emma have shown us that true partnership is built not in comfort, but in shared struggle, mutual respect, and unwavering support through life's greatest challenges." The church was filled with people who had known Emma during her lowest moments, shopkeepers who had seen her searching for scraps, townspeople who had watched her struggle through brutal winters, individuals who had witnessed her transformation from desperate survivor to accomplished woman. "Do you, Emma Catherine Walsh, take Marcus James Thompson to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in prosperity and hardship, in sickness and health, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Emma said clearly, her voice carrying easily through the small church. The words felt like a promise not just to Marcus, but to herself, a commitment to the life they had built together and the future they would continue creating. "Do you, Marcus James Thompson, take Emma Catherine Walsh to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in prosperity and hardship, in sickness and health, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Marcus replied, his eyes fixed on Emma's face with unmistakable love and admiration. "More than anything in this world." As they exchanged rings that Marcus had crafted himself from silver he had mined years earlier, Emma thought about the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. Less than a year ago, she had been convinced that she would die alone and forgotten, just another casualty of circumstances beyond her control. Instead, she had found not just survival, but love, purpose, and a future filled with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The mountain that had tested them so severely had also provided everything they needed to build a life together. Challenges that revealed their true characters, isolation that allowed their relationship to develop naturally, and hardships that proved their commitment to each other was unshakable. The reception that followed was a community celebration that reflected how completely Emma's status had transformed. People who had once ignored her now sought her advice about everything from food preservation to natural medicine. Her knowledge, hard-earned through necessity, was finally receiving the recognition and respect it deserved. "Tell us about the mining camp journey," requested Dr. Morrison, the town's physician. "I'm particularly interested in how you handled the medical aspects of extended travel in extreme conditions." Emma found herself the center of conversations about survival techniques, wilderness medicine, and resource management. Her experiences, once sources of shame and secrecy, had become valuable knowledge that others wanted to learn from and emulate. After the ceremony, as they prepared to return to their mountain home, Emma stood with Marcus outside the church where they had been married, looking up at the peaks that rose around Millbrook Valley like cathedral spires. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the valley floor, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold and pink that took her breath away. This landscape had nearly killed her, had tested her beyond every limit she thought she possessed, but it had also given her everything that truly mattered. "Ready to go home?" Marcus asked, his arm around her waist, their newly exchanged rings catching the light. Emma smiled, understanding that home wasn't just the cabin they had built together, but the life they were creating through shared challenges. mutual respect, and love that had grown from the deepest foundations of trust and partnership. "More than ready," she replied, feeling the truth of those words in every fiber of her being. As they began the familiar climb back toward the high country, Emma Walsh Townsend reflected on the promise Marcus had made to her that first day when she was still fighting for scraps. "You'll never hunger again." He had kept that promise in ways that went far beyond simply providing food. She would never again hunger for acceptance, for purpose, for the security that came from knowing someone valued her completely. She would never again hunger for a place to belong, for meaningful work that used her abilities, or for the kind of partnership that made difficult challenges manageable and good times even better. The trail back to their mountain home was familiar now, but Emma saw it with new eyes. Every landmark reminded her of lessons learned, challenges overcome, and growth achieved through partnership with someone who had seen her potential when she couldn't see it herself. As they climbed higher, leaving the valley behind, Emma thought about all the people she had been, the protected daughter of loving parents, the desperate orphan fighting for survival, the cautious partner learning to trust again, the capable woman who had saved them both through courage and determination. Each version of herself had been necessary, had taught her something essential about survival, about strength, about what she was truly capable of achieving when everything was at stake. Now, as Marcus's wife and equal partner, she was ready to become whoever she needed to be next. The girl who had been dismissed as unmarriageable, who had been told that nobody would want her, had found someone who didn't just want her but needed her, respected her, and loved her exactly as she was. Together, they had proven that sometimes the most beautiful love stories grew from the most unlikely beginnings, and that true partnership could transform not just individual lives but create something entirely new and wonderful in the processes. Behind them, Millbrook Valley spread out in the afternoon sunshine, peaceful and prosperous. Ahead of them, the mountain trail led toward home, toward the life they were building together, and toward a future that promised challenges they would face as partners and joys they would share as equals. Emma had learned to do more than simply survive. She had learned to live fully, love deeply, and build something lasting with someone who saw her strength instead of her struggles. The mountain had tested them both and found them worthy not just of survival, but of happiness. As the sun set behind the western peaks and the first stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Emma Walsh Townsend understood that she had found everything she had never dared to dream of wanting. The promise had been kept, completely and forever. She would never hunger again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.